Welcome back to Odd Socks. I thought, because it's a bit of another rubbish day, there's still quite a breeze and it is trying to rain all the time. I thought I'd take you into our greenhouse and actually have a look at what our tomatoes are doing. And yes, you heard that right. I have tomatoes in our polytunnel. So, welcome to our polytunnel. Now, this polytunnel is what we built last year out of pallets, and it's the same design as we're working on at the moment for the new polytunnel. Now, as you can see in here, we have an awful lot of tomatoes. We started these seeds about mid-March, I think it was, so around about 4 to maybe 5 weeks ago. Now, we started them at home and we used old toilet roll holders, you know, the middle of the tubes. And we started off in there because it was much simpler. And then once they grew up to a very small size, we actually just transferred the whole of that toilet roll into a new pot, making it much easier, much quicker, and definitely something I'll be doing again for next year. Now, the tomatoes that we have got in here, I think there is 28 varieties, which is an awful lot. We're still kind of experimenting with our varieties of tomatoes because we use a lot for cooking and we also use them for fresh. And a lot of the times the fresh tomatoes can be absolutely fantastic, but not as good and juicy for our cooking needs. So because this year we are only growing tomatoes in this polytunnel, no chilies I don't think are going to go into the beds at least. We may have 1 or 2 pots in here because yes, we have an awful lot of chilies too. In fact, we have about 100 or so chilies, which I have just spent the time potting them up to a slightly bigger pot. If you haven't seen that chili video on how our chilies are doing this year, and I think it's 10 or 11 varieties I think we're actually growing this year, I'll leave the link in the description and you can go and watch how well our chilies are actually doing. But back to the tomatoes. So you can see we have an awful lot already in the ground in our polytunnel. Now, we do not recommend you come and plant your tomatoes in your polytunnels at this time of year. We've taken a risk simply because, again, it is space. Now, we did leave it a little bit longer than what we sowed last year, but if we were keeping these in the house, we probably would have sown a little bit later. But the whole point is with tomatoes, the reason why you do start them off a little bit earlier is to make sure all those tomatoes on that vine are going to ripen in time before the late autumn, early winter weather hits. Now, these had been out for about 10 days, give or take a day either side. And we have actually, on very cold nights, we have been fleecing the tops of them. Now, this is important. Your tomatoes will tolerate a form of cold. It will slow them down, but it won't necessarily kill them. Extreme colds or below freezing, yes, they're really not going to be happy. But most of the temperatures have been above freezing, and when there is a frost in the air, or it does get below 3 degrees for us, we do fleece the tops of these tomatoes just to try and protect those leaves. Now, we can't do that with the chilies. The chilies would not tolerate as much as what these tomatoes tolerate. And yes, again, we have taken a risk this year with our tomatoes, but we always seem to get good crops here in our polytunnels. With that 23 varieties, I'll pop a list here of what varieties we're actually growing. Now, some we have grown in previous years, some it's our first time. So it'll be an interesting take on how well these tomatoes actually do. Now, you can see with these tomatoes, we've actually got them in pots, but the pots are bottomless. We've cut the bottoms off these pots and then pushed them into the ground. So when we planted these, the soil was a lot lower. And as they have grown over the last 10 days, we've added more and more compost, removing those lower leaves. This will give it an extra root system, making it a much, much sturdier plant. Now, you can plant straight into the ground. You don't necessarily have to do this extra pot method, but for us, it really does help with the extra roots, giving it that strength to climb up these strings, because we do have our tomatoes growing on strings, which we train to go up and sometimes in some varieties actually over. Last year it worked really, really well for us in this newer polytunnel, and hoping this year it's going to be the same. And they have grown really well since they were sown 4, maybe 5 weeks ago. And in fact, I'm quite surprised at how quickly these have shot up. They seem to be quite happy. Yes, it's not ideal having them outside at this time of year, but there is a certain amount of protection in your polytunnel. But don't be under any of the false pretense that you won't get frost in your polytunnel. You certainly can, both in your greenhouse and your polytunnel at this time of year. So if you are going to risk it, I would just risk a few and make sure that you have some fleece on hand to cover, to protect that foliage from any damage. Now, we actually have about 50 pots of tomatoes in here, in the ground already. And that, I think that then leaves us around about the 60 or 70 plants left to go somewhere. That's an awful lot of plants. But again, we do grow them for family members who don't have the space to grow from seed. And we have got plenty of room outside. Now, where they're going to go outside, I still haven't decided, because I do keep changing my mind a little bit. I think I've got somewhere for them to go, but I really am going to have to think, because they will take up quite a bit of room, because I want to try and keep all the tomatoes in one area. Plus, I want to make sure that I'm growing outside more blight-resistant tomatoes, because as it gets later on in the year, the same as last year, we will get blight. Now, our tomatoes outdoor last year were so poor with quality. It really, really was bad. It wasn't a good year for our outdoor tomatoes. Where our indoor tomatoes, we had a fantastic crop off them last year. And I was harvesting all the way into autumn last year of our tomatoes. But for outside, I want to make sure that it is going to be something that can be a bit more blight resistant and is better for growing in outdoor conditions. So I'll have to go through what I've actually got here and have a look and have a bit more of a read on some of these varieties and see which ones can definitely go outside. Now, we have added some blood, fish and bone to this particular beds just to help these tomatoes along a little bit. Tomatoes are very, very hungry plants, and you don't always have to feed them at this time of year, and most people won't start feeding them until they start flowering and fruiting at least. But we've only put a small amount in just to help boost any leaf growth at the moment. But we won't be feeding any more until we start seeing those flowers that will hopefully produce an abundant amount of fruit. But other than that, these are no dig beds. We pulled out everything that was in here from last year, all the weeds, other bits and pieces. But obviously we have got some self-seeded nasturtiums, and I do believe, well, there was a few marigolds here as well, so they may start making an appearance quite soon. Now, we're not going to take the nasturtiums up. They are really handy for the local pollinators, and the slugs and the snails will prefer to snack on them than our more precious tomato plants. Now, I will be sowing more marigolds for in here. I have got a few different varieties, and they will be sowing, I think I'll start them next week, so we can get them into the ground here in the polytunnel. The one thing that you will find as well, if you grow tomatoes in the same area each year, you may get 1 or 2 volunteer tomatoes. Now, these tomato plants are from seeds that have dropped from the tomatoes the previous year. Any tomatoes that maybe we forgot to pick up or have rotted away and set that seed somewhere in that soil. And we're going to leave them because, one, I'm curious to see what variety they are and how healthy they are throughout the year. Now, they're looking quite good because I'm really curious to see as well whether seeds that have been outdoors all through the winter in that soil waiting to sprout, no intervention at all, to see how healthy and how good those fruits are, instead of all the mummy coddling that we have to do throughout the whole of the year. So I'm really interested to see how that one performs. So that's our tomatoes in our polytunnel. Yes, it's a bit of a risk, but it is a risk we seem to take most years from about mid-April onwards. I think if I'd had a heated greenhouse or a heated polytunnel, I probably wouldn't be so worried. But there's always a risk of losing all these tomato plants. But fingers crossed, we should be okay. But how are your tomatoes doing? Are you growing a larger variety this year, or growing varieties that you've never had before? Have you not long sowed the seeds, or are you one of those diehards that will sow their tomato seeds in the depths of winter come mid-January? I'm glad that we held off this year a little bit longer for our tomatoes, but I also know a few people that do sow them really, really early, but they have somewhere that's good for lighting and protection to grow them on, and they get a superb, really early crop of tomatoes. For us, that may be in the future at some point, but at the moment, we'll have to grow them like majority of the people here in the UK.